Welcome back to the deep dive. If you joined us last time, you'll remember we got deep into Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Specifically that powerhouse concept he gave us, creative destruction.
Yes, the capitalist engine itself. We talked about how he saw it as this fundamentally evolutionary process, a perennial gale, constantly churning, destroying old economic structures to make way for new ones. And that's where the prosperity comes from.
Exactly, that was the foundation. But today our mission shifts. We're diving into what's arguably Schumpeter's most provocative and maybe most important claim, right? Chapters 8 through 14.
Definitely. We're tackling the big paradox he lays out. How can this system, which is so incredibly successful, so dynamic, actually create the very conditions for its own downfall?
It sounds completely backwards. Usually systems fail because they don't work.
Precisely. And Schumpeter's answer is, well, it's quite stark. He basically says capitalism isn't doomed because it fails economically. He shoots that idea down quite forcefully.
Right.
It's doomed because it succeeds too well. Its own relentless drive for efficiency, for rationality, ends up eroding the cultural and institutional ground it stands on. The very things like private property, the entrepreneurial spirit, they get undermined by the system's success.
Okay, so this is a big shift in focus for us. We're moving beyond pure economics, really, into sociology, psychology, looking at how institutions decay.
That's right.
And it starts, interestingly, by questioning something absolutely fundamental in economics, the idea of perfect competition.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally economics, certainly what you learn in Econ 101, holds up perfect competition as the gold standard, right? The ideal for efficiency, for allocating resources just right.
It's the benchmark.
Yeah.
But Schumpeter comes along and says, hang on, in the real world, the world of that perennial gale of constant disruptive innovation, perfect competition often isn't just unhelpful, it can actually be destructive.
Destructive? How so? Well, think about static versus dynamic efficiency. If you freeze everything at one point in time, perfect competition looks great, lots of small firms, prices driven down to cost, very efficient in that moment.
Okay.
But Schumpeter says the competition that really matters, the one driving progress, isn't about, 10 corner shops haggling over pennies.
Right.
It's the competition from the new thing, the new technology, the new product, the new way of organizing. The kind of competition that, as he puts it, strikes not at the margins of the profits and the outputs of existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives.
That's a powerful image. It's not nibbling at the edges, it's attacking the core.
Exactly. And this leads him to flip the script on big business. Practices that are usually condemned, being restrictive, monopolistic, things like barriers to entry, keeping innovation secret for a while, patents, even keeping prices steady.
Things we're normally told are bad for consumers, bad for the economy.
Right. Schumpeter argues they're often not roadblocks to progress. They can actually be necessary mechanisms for progress.
Necessary how? Like shock absorbers.
Kind of. He calls them protective devices. Think about major innovation, building a national railroad network, developing the aluminum industry from scratch, creating the next generation of software. These things take huge, risky, long-term investments.
Okay. Massive upfront costs.
Massive costs and massive uncertainty, especially when the whole market landscape is constantly shifting because of that gale of creative destruction.
So without some protection, maybe nobody would take that risk.
That's his point. And this is where he gives us that really famous analogy, the one that sums up this whole section.
Yes. The brakes.
The brakes. He says these seemingly restrictive practices, they kind of steady the ship. They give the entrepreneur, the innovator, the breathing room, and the financial security they need to actually attract that long-term capital. And he says, and this quote is just perfect, there is no more of paradox in this than there is in saying that motor cars are traveling faster than they otherwise would because they are provided with brakes.
It's such a brilliant way to put it. The brakes, the patents, the temporary market dominance, maybe the ability to charge a bit more for a while, they let the car of innovation go faster overall on that bumpy road without crashing.
Exactly. Without those brakes, you'd have to inch along, constantly worried about skidding off. If every new idea was instantly met with perfect, cutthroat competition the moment it appeared.
The risk would be astronomical.
Astronomical. Why pour billions into R&D if a competitor can just copy you tomorrow and sell it cheaper because they didn't have those R&D costs?
You need a period where you can actually make back that investment and then some.
You need guaranteed profits, or at least the possibility of quick write-offs secured by having some temporary control. That's crucial for planning big, long-range projects in such a volatile environment.
And Schumpeter really emphasizes that it's these large firms, the ones introducing completely new things, that are the real agents of effective competition. He calls them aggressors by nature.
Yes, not the little guys just reacting to market prices. The big innovators are the ones shaking things up. They need that time and space, which they often get by, frankly, discouraging too much short-run competition so they can actually execute these huge revolutionary plans.
Think about something like developing a new breakthrough drug.
Perfect example. The whole pharmaceutical industry relies on patent protection, which is basically a state-sanctioned temporary monopoly to justify the billions spent on research that might lead nowhere.
Okay, but let's tackle one of the big criticisms head-on: price rigidity. The argument is that monopolies keep prices too high and don't lower them, even when demand falls, like in a recession.
Schumpeter pushes back hard on this. First, he says, look at the long run. Are prices really rigid?
Well,
Over decades, prices for things affected by major innovations often fall dramatically, right? Think about the effective cost of computing power, or air travel, or even basic materials like aluminum once the new process is kicked in. Long-run prices are incredibly flexible downwards thanks to technology.
okay, fair point on the long run. But what about the short run? Why not cut prices immediately when a slump hits to get rid of inventory? Isn't that what perfect competition would do?
It is. But Schumpeter argues that kind of short-run price flexibility can actually be destabilizing. If prices instantly crashed in response to every little blip, every seasonal dip, random fluctuation, or cyclical downturn.
Chaos.
Potential chaos, yeah.
Yeah.
He warns it could cause functionless catastrophes. Imagine everyone slashing prices, maybe below cost, triggering bankruptcies, panic. By keeping prices somewhat steady during temporary downturns, firms can maintain up a buffer, avoid panicking the market, and crucially hold on to the profits they need to fund the next wave of innovation when things pick up.
So the short-run rigidity allows for smoother long-run expansion.
That's the argument. It results in steadier and ultimately greater total output over the long haul. He's really warning us not to apply static short-term thinking to a process that is inherently dynamic and long-term.
It's a different frame of reference entirely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that connects to another critique he takes on, the idea that big businesses conserve capital.
Meaning they deliberately hold back on introducing new cost-saving technology because it would mean scrapping their existing still functional factories or machines to protect the value of the old stuff.
Exactly. Critics say they suppress innovation to protect old investments.
But Schumpeter asks, why would a rational manager do that? If a new machine genuinely saves money in the long run, wouldn't rejecting it actually hurt profits?
It absolutely would if the manager is actually trying to maximize profit. Schumpeter clarifies that rational management isn't interested in preserving the historical value of old assets that's a sunk cost. It's gone. They're interested in maximizing the present net value of their total assets, which is all about expected future returns.
So clinging to old tech when better tech exists is just irrational.
It's irrational under capitalism, just as it would be under, say, efficient socialist planning. Trying to artificially prop up the value of old machinery goes directly against the core profit motive.
So why does it sometimes look like they're delaying?
This is where the outsider's perspective can be misleading. Schumpeter talks about ex-ante conservation of capital in expectation of further improvement.
Meaning?
Meaning, sometimes a new invention isn't the final word. It might just be one link in a chain of ongoing innovation. A rational manager might look at it and say, okay, this is better, but I know something even better is likely coming soon. If I retool the whole factory now for this improvement, I'll face another huge write-off in 2 years for the next one. It makes more sense to wait for the truly significant leap.
So what looks like sabotage from the outside is actually strategic waiting.
It can be. It's rational long-range planning in a dynamic environment. The impatient observer, maybe someone without the full technical or market picture, sees a delay and yells, monopoly. They're suppressing progress when it's actually prudent business strategy.
This really forces you to reconsider what we even mean by monopoly.
It does. Schumpeter narrows the definition quite a bit. For him, a true monopoly, a single seller completely insulated from any competitive pressure, is actually pretty rare and usually short-lived in what he calls intact capitalism, unless the government props it up artificially.
So what about the giant corporations we see today? Tech giants, for instance.
He'd likely argue that their dominance, where it exists, usually comes from providing genuinely superior methods, products, or quality. They often create what they exploit, meaning they built the market they now dominate through innovation.
Their success is based on efficiency, not just market power.
Primarily, yes. Their prices might not actually be higher than what less efficient, smaller firms operating under perfect competition would have charged for a similar, maybe inferior product. In his view, these large firms are often the vehicles of dynamism, not the cause of stagnation.
Okay, so if Schumpeter is making this incredibly strong case for the economic resilience and dynamism of capitalism, even with large firms and monopolistic practices, where does the doom come from if it's not economic failure?
Then it has to be something else, and that's the pivot. He concludes the economic engine is fine, maybe even too fine. The problem lies in the sociological and cultural fallout of that engine's success. Creative destruction, the very thing that ensures economic vitality, also unleashes forces that eat away at the system's social foundations.
So the machine works, but it poisons the ground it sits on.
That's a good way to put it. It destroys its own institutional supports.
All right, but before Schumpeter gets to that sociological decay, he needs to clear the decks of other arguments, right? He has to definitively rule out the idea that capitalism might just run out of steam economically.
Exactly. There was a very prominent idea floating around in his time, kind of aligned with some Marxist and Keynesian thinking, about vanishing investment opportunities.
The idea that capitalism would just naturally stagnate, hit a ceiling, and fall into permanent crisis because there was nothing left to invest in.
Pretty much. That the big opportunities were gone, and the system would just sort of grind to a halt. Schumpeter systematically takes apart the main material reasons people gave for this impending stagnation.
Okay, what was the first big reason?
The closing of the geographic frontier. No more continents to discover, no more vast tracts of land to open up and exploit. The American West was settled, Africa was carved up. Where would the next big investment boom come from?
That seems like a reasonable concern on the surface.
It does, but Schumpeter says, hold on. First, opening up those new lands wasn't just something that happened. It was a capitalist achievement. It required railroads, steamships, advanced machinery, all products of business enterprise.
Right, the infrastructure itself was a massive investment.
Precisely. And second, just because that specific frontier closed doesn't mean all frontiers closed. Investment opportunities just shift. He points to things like the conquest of the air, aviation was just taking off, or huge potential in chemical industries, infrastructure within existing countries, entirely new consumer goods.
So the nature of the frontier changes, but the potential for large-scale investment remains.
That's his argument. He felt it was just baseless pessimism to assume future frontiers wouldn't be as economically significant as geographical expansion was. Innovation finds new outlets.
Okay, what was the second supposed nail in capitalism's coffin?
Population. Specifically, slowing population growth or even decline in Western countries. The argument was that fewer people means less demand, which means less need for investment.
We still hear echoes of that today, don't we? Concerns about aging populations and shrinking markets.
Absolutely. But Schumpeter dismisses this too on purely economic grounds. He argues a falling birth rate doesn't automatically kill investment or reduce output per person.
Why not? Fewer customers seems like a problem.
Well, first, the money not spent on raising more children doesn't just vanish. It gets diverted to other things, maybe higher quality goods, more services, new kinds of experiences. Demand shifts. It doesn't just disappear. And second, technology keeps marching on. Labor-saving devices, automation, increased efficiency. These things allow output per worker to keep rising, even if the total number of workers stabilizes or shrinks slightly. Productivity growth can compensate for slower population growth.
So economically, the system can adapt.
It can adapt. Now, he does think slowing population growth has a profound effect, but not on the economic possibility of growth. It has a huge effect on the sociology and psychology of the capitalist class, particularly the family, which we'll definitely get back to. That's where the real impact lies for him.
Interesting. So it matters, but not in the way the stagnation theorists thought.
Exactly. He basically saw both the old Malthusian fear of too many people and the newer fear of too few people as economically misguided. The system is flexible.
Right, so no geographic limit, no demographic limit. What was the third reason people thought capitalism was doomed economically?
Technology itself. The idea that basically all the really big inventions had already happened. Steam, electricity, the internal combustion engine, railroads, steel. That great strides have been made. Future innovation would just be incremental improvements, not take transformative enough to drive massive new waves of investment like in the past.
Kind of a we've invented everything important argument.
Pretty much. And Schumpeter found this view almost insulting to human ingenuity. He calls technological possibilities an uncharted sea. How can we possibly know what breakthroughs are coming?
We can't predict the future.
Exactly. He points out that this kind of pessimism usually crops up during economic downturns, when people are naturally focused on the immediate gloom. Just because we can't clearly see the next electricity-level disruption doesn't mean it isn't out there. He mentions chemistry, biology, fully realizing the potential of electricity. The possibilities were and are immense.
So he essentially says, look, on purely technical and material grounds, capitalism is incredibly resilient. It's got unlimited potential for innovation and growth. There are no inherent economic ceilings.
That's the crucial takeaway from these chapters. If the system is going to crumble, the reasons must lie elsewhere. They must be internal, but not economic. They have to be sociological, cultural, institutional.
Which leads us directly into the next really fascinating part of his argument.
Yes, the idea that capitalism creates a civilization, a way of thinking, that ultimately turns against it.
This is where things get really deep, I think. Schumpeter's arguing that capitalism isn't just an economic system, it's a cultural force. It actually created the modern way of thinking.
It's a powerful, almost counterintuitive idea. We often think of the Enlightenment rational thought science leading to capitalism. Schumpeter flips it. He says the daily grind of economic life under capitalism, the need to calculate, to plan, to measure, to compete, that's what trained humanity in rational thought.
The sheer necessity of making a living in a market economy forces you to be rational.
In a very specific way.
Exactly.
Think about his example, double-entry bookkeeping. Seems incredibly mundane, right?
Debits and credits. Yeah, not very exciting.
But Schumpeter sees it as revolutionary. Why? Because it's a system based entirely on quantitative empirical tracking. It forces you to be precise about costs, profits, losses. It turns money into this universal yardstick for rational calculation.
Compared to before, where economic success might have been attributed to luck or divine favor or tradition.
Exactly. If your medieval harvest failed, you might blame angry spirits. If your capitalist factory fails, the books show you exactly why costs were too high here, revenues too low there. It demystifies economic life.
And that way of thinking, precise, quantitative, empirical, cause and effect, it doesn't stay confined to the account books, does it?
No, that's the key. He says this rational, calculating mindset starts its conqueror's career. It bleeds out from the marketplace into every other area of life. Science becomes more empirical and mathematical, driven by the needs of navigation, engineering, warfare, all tied to the expanding capitalist economy.
Medicine too.
Yeah.
Administration.
All of it. Think about the rise of modern hospitals, statistically tracking disease, rationalizing public administration. Even art and philosophy become more analytical, more individualistic. He points out that modern science really blossomed alongside commercial capitalism, often outside the old scholastic religious traditions.
So capitalism basically births the modern, rational, skeptical mind.
That's the argument. And this rational mindset leads to incredible achievements. The scientific breakthroughs, the technological marvels, the vastly improved material standards of living, the victories over disease he mentions. The cultural output is undeniable.
But there's a massive downside to this relentless rationalization.
A fatal one, in Schumpeter's view. Because that same rational critical mindset, once unleashed, doesn't just critique inefficient production methods or outdated scientific theories, it starts critiquing everything that isn't based on empirical logical proof, including tradition, religion, social hierarchies, collective loyalties, all the mystic glamour, as he calls it, the non-rational beliefs and values that historically held societies together and gave life meaning beyond pure utility.
It strips the magic out of the world.
Pretty much. Capitalism, he says, is inherently rationalistic and anti-heroic. Success in business requires calculation, shrewdness, hard work, maybe. But it doesn't rely on warrior virtues, on physical courage, on appeals to divine right or ancient loyalties like the old feudal order did.
It's fundamentally utilitarian. Does this work? Does it make money?
Exactly. And that utilitarian, anti-heroic nature is a huge political weakness for the ruling class. It creates the bourgeoisie.
How so? Why is being anti-heroic a problem for ruling?
Because, Schumpeter argues, effectively ruling a society requires more than just economic competence. It needs a degree of moral authority, of popular deference, maybe even a touch of that mystic glamour. The old aristocracy, the kings, they ruled by divine right, by tradition, by the sword things that commanded loyalty beyond rational calculation.
Whereas the capitalist class rules by contract, by balance sheet.
Yes. And while that might be efficient for running a business, it's a very thin basis for political legitimacy. It lacks the emotional resonance, the prestige needed to inspire loyalty or effectively command obedience, especially when the system comes under attack.
So the very rationalism that makes capitalism productive makes its ruling class politically weak.
Precisely. They don't have the same cultural toolkit for ruling as the classes they replaced. And this leads to his chilling conclusion for this section. All the amazing achievements of capitalism, the wealth, the science, the longer lives, are ultimately irrelevant for predicting its future.
Irrelevant? Why?
Because the system's own internal logic, its relentless drive towards rationalization, is pushing it towards transformation anyway. The rational, critical mind it created inevitably turns that critical lens back onto capitalism itself, questioning private property, inheritance, profit, all the foundations.
So the success creates the means of its own critique.
Exactly. The problem isn't that the capitalist machine breaks down. The problem is that the culture, fostered by the machine, becomes hostile to the machine's own existence.
Wow. Okay. That sets up the next stage perfectly.
Yeah.
The decay of the core function itself, right? So if the cultural atmosphere is becoming hostile, Schumpeter also identifies a decay within the economic engine itself. Not its overall productivity, but the role of its key player, the entrepreneur.
This is absolutely central. The entrepreneur, for Schumpeter, isn't just any business owner. They are the specific figure who drives change, who introduces the new combination, the new product, new method, new market, the innovator.
The heroic individual breaking the mold.
Exactly. But Schumpeter observes that as capitalism matures, the very process of innovation starts to become, well, routine.
Yeah.
Mechanized, bureaucratized.
How does progress get mechanized? Isn't innovation always about bright ideas?
It is, but where those ideas come from and how they're implemented changes. Instead of the lone genius having a eureka moment and risking everything to build it, innovation increasingly becomes the work of specialized teams in corporate R&D departments.
Ah, so it moves from the individual visionary to the organized group.
Right. It becomes predictable. You hire smart people, give them a budget, set targets. Economic progress becomes calculable, manageable. It turns from, as he says, a flash of genius into office work.
He uses a military analogy here too, doesn't he?
He does. He compares it to how modern warfare changed generalship. Think of Napoleon leading his troops personally versus a modern general managing logistics and strategy from a high-tech command center. The function directing military effort is still there, but the personal leadership, the individual heroism, the high prestige, it's replaced by rationalized, specialized, often anonymous office work.
And the same thing happens in business. The swashbuckling founder is replaced by the salaried CEO and teams of MBAs.
That's the trend he saw. And this shift from personal, risky innovation to managed, predictable progress is, in his view, fatal for the bourgeoisie as a distinct ruling class.
Why fatal? If innovation still happens, isn't that okay?
Because the entrepreneurial function was the very thing that defined the bourgeois class and justified its existence and its unique rewards, namely profit. Schumpeter defines profit very specifically as the temporary surplus earned by the successful innovator before competitors catch up.
So profit is the reward for taking the risk and creating the new.
Exactly. But if innovation becomes routine office work done by salaried employees, what happens to the entrepreneur?
They disappear.
Or become less important.
Their unique function diminishes. And if the entrepreneur is the engine that constantly revitalizes the capitalist class, bringing in new blood and new wealth based on innovation,
then the whole class loses its dynamism, its reason for being. It loses its core economic function, the source of its specific income, profit. And, Schumpeter stresses, infinitely more importantly, it loses its social function, its very raison d'etre. The hired manager, the corporate executive, they're just highly skilled professionals. Their role, their salary could exist just as easily within a large state-run corporation.
The lines blur between a top executive in a private corporation and a top administrator in a government ministry.
They blur significantly. The specific capitalist justification for their position and income weakens, And this leads Schumpeter to that really provocative quote.
The one about who the real pioneers of socialism were.
Yes. He says something like, the true pacemakers of socialism were not the intellectuals or agitators who preached it, but the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers.
How could these arch-capitalists be paving the way for socialism?
Because by creating the giant, rationalized, bureaucratized corporations, they effectively killed off the small, independent, owner-managed firm, which was the bedrock of classic capitalism. They replaced individual enterprise with managed systems. They built these huge, complex organizations that operated almost like planned economies internally.
Making them easier to take over.
Precisely. They created structures so impersonal, so rationalized, that the shift from being owned by shareholders to being owned by the state seemed technically less and less disruptive. They unintentionally built the institutional framework that socialism could potentially slot right into.
Wow. So the capitalists automate themselves out of a job, in a sense.
Out of their unique social and economic role, yes. And this internal decay of function happened at the same time, Schumpeter argues, as capitalism was busy destroying the external structures that used to protect it.
You mean the pre-capitalist stuff? The aristocracy, the church, the guilds?
Exactly, what he calls the flying buttresses. The bourgeoisie, in its own struggle for freedom and power, fought against the constraints of feudalism, the privileges of the nobility, the power of the church, the rules of the guilds.
Which seemed like progress, right? Removing barriers to trade and individual initiative.
It was progress in one sense. But Schumpeter argues the bourgeoisie didn't realize they were also dismantling the very social structures that provided the political stability and non-rational authority they themselves needed but couldn't generate.
Why did they need the aristocracy, for example?
Because the aristocracy, the old landed gentry, had the ingrained habit of command, the military tradition, the social prestige, that mystic glamour again. They provided the steel frame of government administration and social order that the purely rational, utilitarian, and, frankly, politically inept bourgeois class lacked. They ruled by authority, not just contract.
So when the bourgeoisie tore down the castle walls to build their factories,
they inadvertently tore down their own political protection. The bourgeois class, being rationalist and anti-heroic, finds it very difficult to defend itself politically using non-rational means. It relies on argument, lobbying, economic pressure. It lacks the ability to command instinctive loyalty or deference.
And that famous line comes to mind again.
The stock exchange is a poor substitute for the Holy Grail. You can't inspire deep loyalty with a ticker tape. Without those protective pre-capitalist strata, the bourgeoisie is left politically exposed, vulnerable, and ultimately, Schumpeter suggests, maybe even losing the will to rule or fight for its own system.
So in striving for its own liberation, it destroyed its own guards.
A profound irony. It broke the chains that held it back, but also broke the supports that held it up. This sets the stage for the final act of decomposition.
Okay, so the function of the entrepreneur is fading. The external political supports are gone. Now, Schumpeter looks at the core institution itself, private property, and he argues it starts to crumble from within.
Yes, this is a crucial piece. The very same process of large-scale industrialization that squeezed out the small, independent farmer or shopkeeper, the traditional, numerous defenders of private property, also fundamentally changed the nature of property within the big corporations.
This is what you called the evaporation of property. How does that work?
Think about the difference. For the small farmer, property is tangible. It's this land, these tools, this barn. For the factory owner of early capitalism, it's my factory, my machines. There's a direct, physical, personal connection.
You can see it, touch it, defend it.
Exactly. But what happens with the rise of the giant, publicly traded corporation? Ownership transforms into, well, just a piece of paper, a share certificate, or nowadays just an electronic entry.
A line on a brokerage statement?
Right. Schumpeter puts it perfectly. The capitalist process, by substituting a mere parcel of shares for the walls of and the machines in a factory, takes the life out of the idea of property.
Takes the life out of it. That's a strong phrase. What does that loss of life mean?
It means property becomes dematerialized. It's abstract, impersonal. It becomes detached from the functions of management and control, which are now handled by salaried executives. Ownership becomes passive, absentee.
And this changes how people feel about it, both the owners and the public.
Profoundly. The owner of a few shares in a massive, faceless corporation doesn't have the same fierce personal motivation to defend his property as the owner-manager defending his factory. The emotional connection, the pride of creation and ownership, it evaporates.
And for the workers or the public looking at this giant entity.
It loses moral legitimacy. It's much easier to resent or attack an abstract corporation owned by distant, anonymous shareholders than it is to resent the local family business where you know the owner and see them working alongside you.
So the very structure of modern corporate capitalism makes property less defensible, psychologically and politically.
Yes, it creates a form of ownership that is almost designed to be politically vulnerable because it lacks that tangible, personal, morally resonant connection. It becomes sterile.
Okay, so the bourgeoisie is losing its function, its political cover, and the very institution of property is dissolving. What's the active force driving the attack? This brings us to the intellectuals.
Oh, yes. Perhaps Schumpeter's most controversial and famous argument. He claims that capitalism, uniquely among social systems, creates, educates, funds, and politically protects a group with a vested interest in social unrest, the intellectuals.
That's a very specific charge. How does he define intellectual here? It's not just anyone smart or educated, is it?
No, not at all. His definition is quite precise. Intellectuals are people who primarily work with words and ideas, writers, journalists, academics, commentators. Crucially, they generally lack direct experience of or responsibility for practical affairs, like running a business or managing production. And partly because of this detachment, they tend to develop a critical attitude, an onlooker or outsider perspective. Their profession, in a sense, is critique.
And how does capitalism create this class?
Through several mechanisms. The printing press, mass literacy, universities, relatively cheap communication, all these are fostered by the wealth and dynamism of capitalism. They create both the tools for intellectuals and a widening audience for their ideas. Plus, capitalism requires a large administrative and professional workforce, fueling the expansion of higher education.
But the problem comes when education expands too much.
That's his argument. The sheer success of capitalism in promoting higher education inevitably leads to an oversupply in many white-collar fields. You end up with large numbers of people who are highly educated but find themselves unemployed, or stuck in jobs they feel are beneath them, or perhaps just temperamentally unsuited for the compromises of practical work, what he starkly calls psychically unemployable.
Psychically unemployable. That sounds harsh. What's he getting at?
It points to a mismatch between expectations and reality. Someone gets a degree, maybe in the humanities or social sciences, develops a critical perspective and certain expectations about their role in society, but then finds the labor market doesn't value their specific skills highly, or there aren't enough positions that offer the status or influence they feel they deserve.
Leading to frustration, resentment.
Deep frustration and resentment, yes.
Yeah.
They feel undervalued by the system. And Schumpeter argues this creates a social group often concentrated in cities, in media, in academia that feels alienated from and hostile towards the existing capitalist order.
Exactly. The intellectual, trained in wielding words and arguments, often using the very tools of rational critique capitalism provided, takes this widespread discontent, not just their own, but also that of other groups like disillusioned workers, and gives it shape. They verbalize it, they provide the theories, the slogans, the narratives like class struggle, exploitation, alienation.
They become the organizers and spokespeople for anti-capitalist sentiment. Often, yes. And Schumpeter notes they often take the lead, not necessarily because the masses demanded their leadership, but because the intellectual needs a constituency, needs influence, to fulfill their own sense of purpose. Lacking authority derived from practical achievement, they often gain influence by criticizing, by flattering, promising, and inciting, as he puts it.
And the tragic irony for the bourgeoisie
Is that they can't effectively fight back against this intellectual hostility without violating their own core principles. How do you censor critics when you believe in freedom of the press? How do you clamp down on radical academics when you uphold academic freedom?
You're trapped by your own values.
Precisely. The bourgeoisie must, by its own creed, tolerate and even subsidize the very class that is actively working to undermine its legitimacy. It's like funding your own gravediggers, a cultural self-destruct mechanism.
This internal erosion goes even deeper, doesn't it? Right into the heart of private life, the family.
Yes, this is the final piece of the internal decomposition puzzle. The same relentless logic of rational calculation, the cost-benefit analysis that optimizes the factory, eventually gets applied to the family itself.
That inarticulate system of cost accounting enters the home.
Exactly. People, especially in the bourgeois class that fully absorbed this rational mindset, start weighing the pros and cons of having children. They calculate the costs, not just financial, but the heavy personal sacrifices in terms of career, freedom, leisure, lifestyle alternatives.
And children unlike in pre-capitalist societies, are no longer economic assets, right? They're mostly economic liabilities in modern urban life.
Right, so the rational calculation increasingly points towards having fewer children, or none at all. Utilitarianism replaces the older, more instinctive or duty-based view of family.
And Schumpeter connects this to changes in lifestyle, too, like the move away from big family homes.
Yes, he talks about the evaporation of consumers' property. The big house, filled with durable heirlooms needing lots of upkeep and maybe staff, gives way to the smaller, more efficient apartment. Services previously done in the home, cooking, cleaning, childcare, are outsourced. The focus shifts from accumulating long-lasting consumers' capital to consuming transient services and experiences. Rational efficiency optimizes private life, too.
Okay, smaller families, different lifestyles. What's the devastating economic consequence of this for capitalism?
It dramatically shrinks the time horizon of the typical capitalist.
The time horizon, what does that mean?
Traditionally, Schumpeter argues, a major driving force behind the capitalist's relentless work and accumulation was the desire to build something lasting for the family, for the wife, the children, the dynasty, the family home, the family business, securing the future for generations. That was the mainspring.
Working for something beyond your own lifetime.
Exactly. The capitalist ethic involved saving and investing for a future you might not personally see. But if the family unit weakens, if the desire to build a dynasty fades, if there are fewer or no children to inherit, why sacrifice present enjoyment for a distant, abstract future?
The motivation changes.
Fundamentally, the time horizon shrinks. You become more focused on maximizing your own comfort and consumption during your own lifetime. Schumpeter sees this leading to an anti-saving frame of mind, a weakening of that core capitalist drive for long-term accumulation.
Even if the objective economic opportunities are still there.
Even then, the psychological engine starts to sputter. The will to sacrifice for the future diminishes.
So we have a decaying function, crumbling institutions, cultural hostility, and now a weakening of the core psychological drive. What's the end result in terms of how the bourgeoisie behaves politically?
Meekness. That's the word he uses. Profound political meekness.
Meekness, how does that show itself?
He observes how readily the bourgeois class seems to absorb the criticisms of its enemies, how willing it is to compromise on fundamental principles, how often it responds to direct attacks, things like highly progressive taxation, regulations perceived as hostile, threats of nationalization with appeasement, with talk, with concessions, rather than a robust defense of its own system and ideals.
They seem unable or unwilling to stand up and fight for capitalism.
That's his assessment. They lack the conviction, the self-belief. They've been educated by their critics. They've internalized the guilt. Schumpeter concludes the only explanation for this level of meekness is that fundamentally the bourgeois order no longer makes any sense to the bourgeoisie itself and that it does not really care.
They've lost faith in their own system.
And they lack the older, non-rational tools of rule and the personal, tangible connection to property that might inspire them to fight for an abstraction that feels increasingly hollow, even to them.
So we circle back to the core thesis. Capitalism isn't failing economically like Marx predicted. It's succeeding so powerfully on its own terms, rationalization, bureaucratization, wealth creation, that it destroys the social, cultural, and psychological foundations needed to sustain itself.
Precisely. Its success creates a society and a ruling class that are, paradoxically, ripe for transformation into something else. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, that's a truly sweeping and, frankly, quite sobering analysis from Schumpeter. We've traced his argument for this inherent tendency towards self-destruction within capitalism, not through economic collapse, but through this deep cultural and institutional erosion.
Yeah, he paints a picture where the system itself, through its very operations, cultivates a social environment, a psychological mindset, and even a managerial class that becomes increasingly compatible with, or at least indifferent to, a transition towards socialism.
All the factors he lays out, the mechanization of progress, making the entrepreneur obsolete, the evaporation of property's meaning, the rise of a critical intellectual class, the rationalization of family life weakening the long-term motive, they all seem to point in one direction.
Towards a future where the capitalist framework just withers away because the will and the structures needed to maintain it have dissolved. It's not necessarily a violent revolution he foresees, but more of a gradual transformation.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with some really big questions, especially looking at our world today, right? With giant global corporations, the pace of tech disruption, ongoing debates about inequality and the role of the market.
Absolutely. Two questions really stand out from this part of Schumpeter's work, I
That's
think.
where
First, can that engine of innovation, that massive expansion of wealth Schumpeter himself celebrated, actually survive in the long run when the driving force shifts almost entirely from that risk-taking, personally motivated entrepreneur to the salaried manager, the predictable corporate bureaucracy? Is R&D by committee really a substitute for the flash of genius?
That's a huge question for economic dynamism today.
And the second one is more cultural, more political. Is capitalism still legitimate in a deep sense if the core idea of private property has become so abstract, so detached from personal responsibility, just that parcel of shares, and if the class that theoretically benefits most from it seems to have lost the conviction, the prestige, maybe even the desire to effectively defend it or lead society?
Has the mystic glamour completely gone, leaving only calculation?
That's what Schumpeter forces us to ask. He's shown us the tendency, the observable drift towards this transformation. Capitalism, in his view, is preparing its own succession.
But he hasn't really told us yet exactly what that successor looks like or how viable it is.
Exactly. And that sets us up perfectly for our final deep dive into capitalism, socialism, and democracy. We've explored why he thought capitalism was inevitably declining. Next time we turn the page and see how he analyzes the alternative that he saw emerging.
Right. So in our next discussion, we'll follow Schumpeter as he shifts gears completely and gives us his pragmatic, almost clinical assessment of socialism, not as an ideology to be cheered or feared necessarily, but as a potential functioning economic system. What's its blueprint? Is it actually feasible? What are the massive institutional hurdles a centrally planned economy would face?
He tries to answer. Could the bureaucratic machine that capitalism built actually run the whole show? It's a fascinatingly objective analysis, stripping away a lot of the usual political heat. Definitely worth tuning in for.
We hope you'll join us. Until then, keep digging deeper, maybe reflecting on that paradox of progress and its potential consequences.